I'm Ann Artis, Director of the College of Arts and Sciences Interdisciplinary Humanities Research Center, as well as Deputy Dean, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the second of two public events today with Professor Ann Kelly Knowles, both of which are part of this year's Public Humanities in a Digital World lecture and workshop series. This series is hosted by the Research Center's Digital Humanities Working Group in partnership with the University of Delaware Library, IT Academic Technology Services, the College of Arts and Sciences, and the English Department. Our external partners this year include Hagley Museum and Library and the Library Company of Philadelphia's Program in African American History. Additional on-campus partners for today's events in particular include the Jewish Studies Program and the Department of Geography. So I take this moment to thank all of our co-sponsors for their generous support of this series, which has created a set of teachable moments about the digital humanities for our campus community over the last 18 months. Before introducing this afternoon's speaker, let me say something more about the genesis of this series. The Digital Humanities Working Group began meeting in spring 2012 to talk about the transformations in scholarly communication practices that are underway in both research and teaching environments. Last year's Perspectives on Digital Humanities lecture and workshop series, which was co-sponsored by the Library, ITATS, the College, and the Department of English, provided hands-on training opportunities for things like TEI and other DH technology tools, and served as a showcase for current UD digital humanities projects. It also brought major figures in the field to campus to give public lectures on topics ranging from issues of copyright and open access, metadata design, to the unique challenges of publicly facing humanities research and the emergence of alternative academic careers. All of these talks are archived on UD Capture and easily accessible through the IHRC's website if you're interested. This year's series, which is also being taped, sustains last year's effort to enliven the campus community's conversations about key issues in this emerging field through engagement with nationally and internationally recognized experts. But it also, and very deliberately, is more focused on institutional infrastructure issues, the how-tos of developing and sustaining humanities research and teaching projects, the issues raised related to authorship, intellectual property, and copyright in collaboratively authored, publicly facing digital research projects and collections, the how-tos of project management and intra- and interinstitutional research and teaching collaborations in humanities disciplines whose research conventions and institutional practices are still designed to recognize and reward the efforts of researchers and teachers working on their own, lone rangers, working in their classrooms on their research projects in the library. So given the focus of this year's series, it's my special pleasure to welcome this afternoon's speaker, Professor Ann Kelly Knowles. Professor Knowles is a professor of geography at Middlebury College, where she teaches courses such as Holocaust Landscapes, Historical Geography of North America, History of Cartography, Historical Geography, and Cultural Geography. Her major publications and edited collections include Mastering Iron, The Struggle to Modernize an American Industry, which was published with Chicago in 2013, Placing History, How Maps, Spatial Data, and GIS Are Changing Historical Scholarship, which came out in 2008, Past Time, Past Place, GIS for History, 2002, and going back further, Calvinists Incorporated, Welsh Immigrants on Ohio's Industrial Frontier, 1997. Professor Knowles received the American Ingenuity Award for Historical Scholarship in 2012 for her pioneering work as both a labor historian and a cultural geographer using 21st century research technologies, namely GIS, and specifically GIS, to pursue research questions and projects that couldn't be investigated without the availability of these research tools. Her current work on the Holocaust has been supported by major grants from the National Science Foundation and the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And it involves collaborations with colleagues at Stanford, the University of Bristol in the UK, Victoria University in New Zealand, Arizona State University, DePaul University, and the U.S. Holocaust Museum. Over the full course of her academic career, Professor Knowles' research has also been supported by prestigious grants and fellowships from the Newberry Library, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the American Council of Learned Societies. Her talk last night at Hagley introduced that audience to a range of projects that she's developed that use geographic information systems technology to understand the past. Her talk for us today, Geographies of the Holocaust, focuses more specifically on her current interdisciplinary, ambitiously interinstitutional collaborative research, which takes a geographical approach to the Holocaust and seeks not only to shed new light on historical questions, but to transform scholars' understanding of one of the most important events of the 20th century. So please join me in offering Professor Knowles a very warm welcome to the University of Delaware campus.
Anne, thank you very much for that generous introduction and for the invitation to come to the University of Delaware. This is my first time here, which is a great delight for me. The Geographies of the Holocaust project began for me when I got a telephone call from the Holocaust Museum in, I think it was spring of 2006. A few of you have heard this story, so forgive me, but it's a bit of important framing, I think. The phone call came from a man in the Registry of Survivors, which is part of the research arm of the Holocaust Museum in DC, and he said that they were expecting an enormous delivery of materials from the International Tracing Service, which was a philanthropic organization set up immediately after World War II to try to gather as much information as possible to enable family members to find one another and find out what happened to sons, daughters, uncles, etc. in the war and especially in the Holocaust. This organization had captured a huge amount of information and they were copying it, making digital copies to send to Washington. They were going to be sending something in the range of 10 million records, most of which had geographic information included, where someone was arrested, where they lived, which camps they went to, and so forth. So this man who called me thought that GIS, Geographic Information Systems, might help them manage that information and enable scholars to make sense of it. GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems. That's a whole class of software that allows you to analyze and map any information that has geographic location. And it's used in an enormous number of ways today. It's fundamental to decision making in nonprofits, in government, in business today. It's a very powerful kind of software. It takes a while to learn. It has, in the last decade or so, been picked up more and more in history and some other humanities disciplines. It's kind of a bad fit with history in some ways. Partly, Anne mentioned that there's a great tradition in the humanities of scholars working alone, going to the archive, immersing yourself in the records, learning and learning, sometimes for years, even decades, and emerging with a book. Now, I've done this myself. I am a great believer in the book, and my book, Mastering Iron, that came out last year was a good example. 16 years working on and off to understand and explain an ignored industry. That tradition has many virtues and advantages. Clarity of vision, a single voice, deep knowledge of material. But what that model of scholarship does not allow, and is generally very wary of today, is collaboration. And GIS almost always requires collaboration because it's a difficult technology to learn, because becoming expert in this quite complicated kind of software usually takes some years, that the historical scholar may not have to give, rarely has to give, to master a whole new, I think of it as a language. It takes as much time as learning a new language to become really good at GIS. And so if you want to use GIS in historical scholarship, you have to be able to work with at least one person and often with a cadre of people, which raises all kinds of questions about research methods and who gets the credit and who writes the articles or the book in the end. The project that I'm going to talk with you about today, the Geographies of the Holocaust Project, has solved those problems by figuring out how to work across disciplinary divides. If I may introduce our chief members here on the screen, we have about an equal balance of GIS experts, cartographers, and geographers, and then initially on the other side of the fence, Holocaust historians. Alberto Giordano at Texas State, a great GI scientist who has done all sorts of forensic applications of GIS, studying cross-border migration from Mexico, for example, technically very gifted. Waitman Bourne, a straight-up Holocaust historian, a former soldier trained at West Point, lieutenant in Iraq, who went on to become an expert in the Wehrmacht. Tim Cole, probably the world's expert on the history of the Holocaust in Budapest, the Budapest ghetto. Simone Gigliotti, a feminist historian who wrote a very powerful book recently on the experience of prisoners transported by train, the cattle car experience. So she theorizes the Holocaust at the level of the body. Chester Harvey, a former student of ours at Middlebury College, a very gifted cartographer. Anna Hollian, a European historian who studies deportees. Paul Jascott, a historian of art and architecture at DePaul University, who has become my closest collaborator. And I must say, Paul is the bravest of us all. He took a GIS course last fall, and he now can make maps with ArcGIS. He is so proud of himself, but it took 6 years for that to happen. Mark Mazeroff, for him to find the time is what I mean. Mark Mazerovsky, another art historian who specializes in tracing stolen Jewish art, particularly in France. And then Eric Steiner, a geographer, cartographer, graphic designer extraordinaire. This team of people was pulled together when Alberto and Tim and I organized an interdisciplinary workshop at the Holocaust Museum at their invitation. And the unusual thing we did that set us on the trajectory that has been so successful is that we decided not just to make this gathering a talking shop where people explained their research to one another. We did some of that, we had to. But we decided very quickly that we also wanted to do live research together. One historian with one geographer into the archives, just dive right in and see what you come up with. It's like put in your thumb and do you pull out a plum? And we also set ourselves the goal of presenting our research on the fly at the Holocaust Museum to an audience of Holocaust historians at the end of 2 weeks. And we did it, and it was experimental, it was risky, but what we discovered with this compressed experiment was that in fact we had an enormous amount to learn from each other, that we respected one another's expertise, and we made a pact right then and there that we were going to form a research group, apply for funding. We got the funding from NSF, and that funded 5 years of research, the fruits of which I'm going to show you today. I wanted to frame this presentation that way so that you can have some appreciation for how many voices are part of this project, that it is as much historical as it is geographical, and that these prototype projects that I'm going to show you were all experiments. We weren't sure what was going to happen, but we had a common curiosity about whether whether studying the Holocaust as a geographical event might be really interesting, and whether the specific methods of geographic information systems could shed new light on this deeply studied subject. So, one of the first things we decided, I think it was on day 3 or 4 of our 2 weeks together, was that there was one key geographical concept that we could use to organize our research, and that is the geographic concept of scale. And what we decided to do, we all agreed that the Holocaust was a fundamentally geographical phenomenon, But it took place at many different scales. So this is how we organized our initial research, and it has resulted in a book whose chapters also follow this organizational scheme. At the broadest scale of the continent, the development, growth, and then collapse of the SS concentration camp system across much of Europe. At the scale of the region, the arrest and deportation of Jews from Italy, mostly to Auschwitz, late in the Holocaust, and the atrocities in the East by Einsatzgruppen and Wehrmacht soldiers, regional scale. At the scale of the city, the Budapest ghetto, and we conceived of Auschwitz as an urban scale. Then at the scale of the social group and the individual, the evacuations out of Auschwitz, columns of individuals, that phenomenon being available to us really only through individual memoir and testimony. So having identified these different scales at which the Holocaust happened, we then set about seeking research materials, forming up partnerships. We insisted that every project have this interdisciplinary component, a geographer and an historian working together. The first example I'm going to show you is the project that I was chiefly involved in, mapping the SS concentration camps. And here I also want to speak just for a moment about the great joy I've had over the last 6-7 years working with undergraduate students at Middlebury College on this project. I'm very proud to name them here. These are students who took classes with me and then became research assistants for at least a little while. Alexander Yule, Ben Blackshear, Charlie Hoffman, Toral Patel, and Raz Vera. Michael DeGroot was an undergraduate history major at Stanford who was able to do some particular research for this project and is also acknowledged in the book. I think it's great to co-author with students. Sometimes that involves, as in the case of Michael, he actually wrote text. He was a very fine writer, and I was happy to incorporate his material. In the other case, students were building databases, developing maps, doing creative visualizations that helped me think about the material. Paul Jascott and I ended up writing 98% of the chapter, but I think we must acknowledge as co-authors anyone who does intellectual work that becomes part of a published piece. That's my own position on this, so I'm very pleased to acknowledge my students. Now, some of what we did in this project was just basic mapping. I think of this as the descriptive part of research. If you're studying a large, complex, dispersed phenomenon, it really helps to begin seeing the distribution of it. This is sort of the first geographical step in understanding history for me. This is a map that displays the basic data that we received from the Holocaust Museum out of their encyclopedia of camps and ghettos, which is just the location of the SS main camps, the very familiar names, Auschwitz, Grossrosen, Mauthausen, Dachau, Buchenwald, and so forth. Those are the larger colored dots. And then the somewhat smaller dots, ooh, somebody ate a cookie. The somewhat smaller dots are the labor camps that were under the supervision or had some kind of connection with the main camps. This is how the encyclopedia is organized. Right away, this display shows some interesting geographical patterns. It also makes quite a profound impression. It did on us, and it has to some audiences. This is only the main camps run by the SS and their labor camps. This is 1,300 locations. Many people don't realize that that was how extensive the system was. We've learned since, in the last year, from our colleagues at the Holocaust Museum, by the time they finish their encyclopedia, they expect to have documented up to 40,000 places of incarceration, punishment, and murder, which you have to have GIS to map and make sense of. So we are encouraged that this basic approach is going to help us understand the much larger phenomenon once they finish their work over the next 10 years or so. So this is sort of step one. Once you have a database, the basic way GIS works, how many folks have never used GIS? Right? Lots of people have not used GIS. One of the basic ways, like behind this map here, is that you have a spreadsheet of information where it's parsed into categories, spatial location, name of the camp, how many prisoners, men or women, and so forth. And that spatial location column goes out to the mapping part of the program so that you can then ask the GIS program a question and it can deliver an answer in the form of a map. So this map is the answer to the question, where were the SS concentration camps? A different question with a subset of this data produced this map. Here the question was, how far are the labor camps from their main camps? Using a GIS method called sightline analysis, which really just draws Euclidean distance between one point and its affiliated point. So you might assume as a sort of neutral starting point, the null hypothesis, if you will, that a rational system would have camps that were equidistant or within a sort of oval or circular shape from the main camp. And we do have some like that, roughly this one, kind of this one. But then you have some very different shapes. This is Buchenwald, which has many camps far out in this direction and just a few up here. There's sort of a skew there. What explains that? Well, part of it is highways and railroad lines. Then you have some really different patterns. The one that really intrigues me that I've not yet followed up, but I've got to answer this question, is Sachsenhausen here, the sort of golden cluster, with the labor camp 800 miles away in Kiev. What is that connection about? Is there some personal connection between a businessman with a factory that's supplying shoes back to Sachsenhausen? Is it someone's brother? Is it something else? So this map is for me an example of how displaying data in map form, visualizing information on the ground, can raise new research questions. So this map has become instrumental in part of my new research agenda on labor and the labor camps in the Holocaust. I wanted to show you a little bit more about how I've worked with students on this part of the project. One of the basic steps you go through when you're trying to use GIS for history and many other applications is that you have analog data, paper information in a map, in a text, in a table, that somehow you need to bring into the computer's way of thinking. And the computer's way of thinking includes locations, right, within the mathematical grid of location for GIS. So here we had a series of maps from the Library of Congress that showed various German economic activities that were captured by the Allies and brought into American archives. This one of iron and steel industry. So if you scan this map, the analog map becomes a digital map. And then you can fit that map with a process called georeferencing to its actual location on the surface of the Earth. Then, having done that, if you extract information on the map, here you just click, it's a simple editing process, you click on the points that you want to capture of certain aspects of industry that become a separate digital layer of information. You do that repeatedly and you can begin to compile information from many historical maps into a new map. So here we have iron and steel, machine tools, shipbuilding, chemicals, food processing, etc. This is just a raw display, but then you can begin to analyze it. So one question for me was, were there concentrations of economic activity and labor camps during the war related to heavy industry? Here is a first, it's called kernel density analysis. It basically picks out clusters of activity in a map of iron and steel, of machine tools in German industry, and then we add the camps. And this is, again, a raw map. This is not analyzed yet, but we're seeing some distributions we might expect, but some that we don't. Like there are concentrations in the center of concentrated industrial activity, but also on the fringes. So maybe the camps were locating near heavy industry, but maybe that was less important than other things. This is not an answer yet. This is a confusing map. This tells me I need to do more work. But it also shows you how layering data in GIS can help you begin to do some fairly complex discovery and then analysis. This is an even rougher map, but it's another starting point for us in this camps project. This is the very first rough mapping of ghettos from volume 2 of the Encyclopedia from the Holocaust Museum. Incredibly dense information, thousands of sites from very large ghettos like Warsaw and Łódź down to very small ghettos in rural locations. My dream, my goal, if I can get somebody to fund it, is to enrich this data set as much as we have the first SS camps data, and then begin to connect them. When did people go to ghettos? When did they go to the camps? If you imagine an animation of ghettos being created and camps begin to grow as the ghettos collapse and are liquidated, that will be a sort of spatial historical narrative that I hope we'll get to in the next 5 years. Second case, we flipped the responsibility, Paul Jascott and I, for this project. Here, Paul was the lead investigator. He's the art and architectural historian in our group. To work with the visual records, the architectural records at Auschwitz. The Auschwitz architectural record is the best preserved of any from the Holocaust because it was a very, very large installation that was intensively planned by architects in Berlin primarily. But then they also fled very quickly as the Russians were approaching and the Allies. There was this imminent squeeze of attack, and the Germans evacuated the entire camp in about 3 days and just left things on the table. So the record is exceptionally rich for this camp, and it's also one of the most important camps. Here's a photograph of some Nazi architects working on the design. Everything was carefully designed, especially in Birkenau, the biggest part of the camp, which combined labor with extermination. That's where the gas chambers were and so forth. So Paul went back to Berlin to the Zentralbauleitung records that he knew so well and made fresh copies from microfilm mostly. And gosh, he's a lovely, lovely person. He really admits when he's feeling vulnerable and scared about things. And he told me, Anne, I don't know how to make maps. I don't know what you want me to do. I said, Paul, what you need to do is just print off some paper copies of your microfilm and start marking it up with colored pencils. Where were the barracks? Where was the barbed wire? And he said, oh, okay, I can do that. So he started color coding the different important elements on these architectural plans, which then our very technically gifted student, Chester Harvey, could bring into GIS. And this is a screenshot from his buildings database. So this is a database where every building is an entry in the spreadsheet that has attached to it who designed it, when it was built, whether it was built, what the function was, and so forth. So this then becomes another kind of map that you can ask questions about. And he also he taught himself CAD. Every now and then you get a student like this. And so he was able to do three-dimensional architectural renderings as well, which eventually ended up in this partial model of Birkenau. Now, what this image is showing is what our first question was of this landscape. What could guards see best and least well in Birkenau? The idea being that GIS could help us understand the surveillance of prisoners and which parts of the camp would prisoners be most exposed to surveillance and, could be shot, and where might they be relatively safe. So that's what this image reflected, but then Paul got thinking, the more time he spent with Chester and the database, about other questions. He realized that because the database also captured whether a building was planned and built or planned and not built, that might be interesting to map. That's what this image is. Let me explain it to you. Here we've used color to pick out 3 different categories of buildings. The green buildings were planned by an architect, the ideal plan, and they were built as planned. So that's a whole row of guards' barracks here. The purple plans were built, they're documented in planning documents, not by architects necessarily, but they were not part of the original ideal plan. In purple, I'll explain those in a moment. And then in yellow, they were on the ideal plan, but they were never built. Well, what does that include? That includes the sort of tuning fork shape in the upper left, which was to be the commandant's headquarters, a grand building built in the style of the Berliner Platz, monumental architecture with a big curving drive so that guests of state would come into this grand sort of approach and be greeted by the commandant, or later the governor or the mayor, because Auschwitz was not just a concentration camp, it was part of the whole vision of conquest of the East and the Germanification of the East, so Auschwitz was going to become a regional capital. Well, they didn't get around to building that. They didn't have the resources, they didn't have the time. What did they build instead? One of the things was this row of guards' barracks here, built in great haste in about 6 weeks in 1944 to house the additional hundreds of guards that were required to handle the shipment of Jews from Budapest. So what this kind of mapping begins to pick out from our perspective is the difference between Nazi rhetoric, Nazi ideals, and the expediencies of war and genocide. We'd like to do a lot more mapping in this line because there's been a great deal of emphasis for very good reasons on analyzing Nazi rhetoric in the historical literature, but actually knowing how things were carried out on the ground is ultimately what matters the most in human history. So we hope that this again gives us a new research agenda. Then my next example, I think I'm doing okay for time, is at the urban scale. The work of my colleagues Tim Cole and Alberto Giordano with Alberto's graduate student Shelley Burleson. And their title here, I think, is excellent. One of the basic differences in ghettoization during the Holocaust, as some of you may know, many ghettos, Warsaw is the classic example, also Łódź in the former Poland, were walled sections of cities that contained the Jewish population. With horrible results. Budapest was a very different case. Instead of bringing Jews to the ghetto, as in Warsaw, they brought the ghetto to the Jew. And what this meant was that city officials decreed ordinances that certain apartments, certain buildings were allowed for Jews and others were not. And what this produced in the city of Budapest was a very mixed pattern of Jews still living next to non-Jews, sometimes even next-door neighbors in a hall in an apartment building, but it was designated as a Jewish residence or a non-Jewish residence. Very interesting case. So that produces geographic patterns like this. What Tim and Alberto did with Shelley's help was digitize a 1944 map of the city. The Holocaust is great to study for one, from a technical point of view because there's so much documentation, not just by the Germans, but you're dealing with 20th century Europe with lots of resources, lots of maps. So they recreated the street plan of Budapest, 1944, and then Tim did additional manuscript research to figure out where all the Jews were allowed to live according to those city ordinances. And those are shown here as street segments that had at least one Jewish residence as of June 1944. The green have a slightly different story I won't go into now. But you see that it's very dispersed. This is a dispersed ghetto, not a concentrated ghetto at this time. Well, in this case, having built the database, they could begin to use a number of GIS techniques to try to understand Jews' experiences in this city. One of the questions they asked was, what happened during the lifting of the curfew for 3 hours every day in the summer of 1944? This was a 3-hour period when Jews could legally walk on the streets. They weren't allowed to ride the streetcars, but they could at least walk, to visit friends, to go to the hospital, to try to get in line at the Swedish legation to get papers to escape Hungary, and just to get food every day. This first map is the result of something called network analysis, where you ask the computer to simulate the movement of X number of people on the streets to get to a certain location. So here they're simulating Jews, they're the little purple dots, leaving their residences, walking the shortest, most efficient distance to a food hall to get their groceries. And what that does is estimate the streets where most Jews probably would have walked for at least part of their journey. What that becomes for the researchers is surrogate evidence for what bystanders witnessed every day between the hours of, I think it was 1 and 4 p.m. Jews walking in the street with their prominent, legally required yellow stars on their outer garments. This is surrogate evidence for bystanders, most of whom left no record of what they witnessed in Budapest day to day. Then to get at the Jewish experience in particular, Alberto and Tim and Shelley simulated how long it would take to walk from every residence to the nearest food hall, the nearest legation, and the nearest hospital. These maps show those results. So here, walking to the food halls, which are visible here in these black shapes, the pale yellow area is the zone within which people have a half-hour walk at most to get to a food hall. So in an hour's time, they could get to the food hall, they could get home, they'd have enough time to get their food and perhaps do something else. The sort of tan-colored zone is an hour to the nearest food hall. And beyond that, where these outliers are, it's more than an hour's walk. And this is, you ask the program to simulate an adult walking at a certain pace. And you can change that pace and sort of do iterative investigation. But this is one of their summary maps. So what this begins to show is the rather desperate situation of people who live at the greatest distance from the food halls. Do they have to find a non-Jew to get their food? Do they risk getting late online and they may not get any food at all? Do they risk being arrested? And then Tim, being a great expert on this city's Jewish experience, was able to go back to the testimonial evidence and find examples of individuals. There was one girl in particular who was the youngest, fittest, fastest one in her family. It was her job to go to the food hall, and one day she was late and she was almost caught by the police. And she could have been shot, she could have been arrested, the family would have been in peril had she been even just put in jail. So even though this looks like very abstract mapping, for us it helps us get to the human story in a way that is difficult to do otherwise, and to see the city as a whole. Oh, sorry, I was going a bit too fast. So that's food halls. This is distance to the legation. And there are large numbers of Jews who are at a great distance from the legation. And this makes it particularly difficult because there were always lines. There was always a queue of people trying to get in. And then lastly, to the hospital, to visit a relative, to bring kosher food, for example. My last example comes from the most difficult project, the most difficult research, which was about the evacuations out of Auschwitz. It's difficult for a number of reasons. For one thing, the evacuees were deeply traumatized. All of them had already spent time in this camp, some of them in many other camps. Many of them had lost some or all of their family members. They were starving. It was just extremely difficult circumstances. And then the evacuations themselves were a new kind of trauma, being marched out of at least the environment they had become familiar with into the complete unknown with armed guards on them and walking through the snow, and many terrible things happened on the way. So this makes their testimony difficult to work with. It's extremely sensitive material. And it also is affected by memory, by what people don't remember, by what they're unwilling to remember. So all of that made us, these colleagues and the rest of us, concerned about what we could show and what we could trust ourselves to claim about this material. They tried making some maps, but they were very unsatisfactory. Just knowing where people went from point A to point B to point C didn't seem to get at the truth of the material or the substance of it. So they began to try some very different approaches. And one thing that they did was take excerpts of testimony from a number of people and convert the map into just place names and distances, which began to reveal parts of the journey that one or more people talked about and other parts of the journey where they said nothing. You look across many testimonies and you begin to see patterns which resulted in this conceptual image by Eric Steiner, our brilliant designer. He just had the idea to take all of that written testimony, break it up into letters, and use it to indicate density of information. So you have lots of information about this, nothing about this zone, and so forth. This is really interesting. It raises more research questions. How else might they find out what was happening here? Is there a guard's testimony that might help fill the gap? Is there bystander testimony? Or do they make enough sort of vague allusions that you can see, oh, everyone was just terribly exhausted, or everyone found food and slept? So I found it a fascinating approach. And what Eric eventually developed as a sort of general approach to this traumatic material was imagistic and artistic representation, rather than anything quantitative, really. And this is his final image. This is now the final image in our book across 2 full pages. He calls it The Rope of History. And he told us that he was sitting at home, and he lives in Oregon, actually, trying to think about this representational problem for the testimonies. And he was holding a string, and he started kind of rubbing it in his hands, and conceived of the march of evacuees, this line moving through the snows of Poland, as a kind of string that frayed and broke at certain points. And taking one woman's testimony, he then purposely worked the string to represent what happened to her. Leaving Auschwitz, marching with her sister and a few women she'd come to know, and then it begins to fray about midway through the journey, and then her sister is shot, and she loses her sister, and the rope almost completely breaks apart for her, but then she gathers herself together and proceeds. And I find this image profoundly expressive. It is, to me, still geographical, but it sort of transmutes geography into human experience, which to me is as much a part of geography as making a map with GIS or studying economic systems. One of the fabulous things about geography is that if you're broad-minded about it, it encompasses almost everything that happens on the surface of the earth, including personal trauma. And I want to end with my students. I also begin with my students. Now, students at Middlebury College are a wonderful bunch of people, generally. They come well prepared, and they come eager to learn for the most part. And those who aren't know why. They have other things going on, so they don't have to worry. But what I have found is that students at the college in our geography program and elsewhere have become deeply interested in this Holocaust project because it matters. And I have had the great pleasure of involving now, this is my 5th course this semester, involving a whole course of students, in this case first semester students in a writing course, in doing research to contribute to the project in their small way, as well as research seminars and research assistants who are directly involved. This photograph is from the first group of students that I taught in the spring of 2008, when we were just starting the Holocaust project. In fact, it was before we got the NSF funding, but these students were really game to try to do some research with me on the project. And we were fortunate to be invited down to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and they replicated willingly the kind of experimental approach that we'd taken in 2007 at the beginning of our research project, the 9 of us scholars. And they decided to spend the semester developing projects that they would present to scholars at the Holocaust Museum. This was taken before their presentations. We weren't sure how it was going to go. It was kind of a nervous-making decision to expose themselves to criticism by experts from around the world, but boy, did it raise their game. And they did fabulous, fabulous projects. I talked about some of them this afternoon, so I think I'm not going to go through it again now, though I'd be happy to answer specific questions if you wish. And here I want to close. This is one of the students' maps. This is Chester Harvey, who was involved in making this map of experience. He mosaicked together a series of 1938 Russian maps that showed the territory that a certain evacuation march went through, and using that map as a base, they could map the progress of the evacuation. They color-coded it to reflect the memoir's expression of emotion. This is one woman's memory of this event. And he also was the cartographer for my book on the iron industry, a very gifted young man. This is Alex Ewell, who developed the basic database structure for the SS camps, concentration camp study. I could not have possibly done what he did. I find working with students, if you let them run to their strengths and learn what they can teach themselves, that they will gain a kind of mastery that gives them great pride and produces excellent work. And then Jack Cuneo was the very first student to animate the concentration camps database and show us change over time. I would not be here without these students. I could not possibly do what I have done. And so I want to fully acknowledge them. And with that, I would be very grateful to take your comments and questions. Thank you.
Questions for Anne?
Yes.
Hi. Thank you for a really thought-provoking talk. I'll preface this by saying I'm a historian, and I'm working on a project right now which has a spatial dimension, and I was telling Matt the way I am handling it is I have a map on the wall and I put push pins in.
Brilliant.
And I have a Google map on my computer for an urban area that I work on where I want to see people moving around in space.
Yes.
So it struck me that your talk was partly about spatiality,
Yes.
a way of thinking about history, and partly about this particular technological tool.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted, for really selfish reasons, I want to know when it's worth it to use GIS, and when it's just as good to have a map on the wall with push pins in it.
You're pitching to my sweet spot, because even though I'm usually invited to speak because I work with GIS, in fact, I believe that GIS is rarely necessary. That by far, the most important thing about transforming one's understanding of history is to think spatially about it. And that putting push pins in a map, drawing with pencil on paper, is far more valuable than spending a whole lot of time learning GIS in hopes that it might be useful. You need to have you need to have a spatial research question for starters. And then once you have your spatial question, you need to understand your material well enough to find the spatial information in it to see if you've got enough there to work with. And that, in historical research, that may take several years. Once you've reached that point, if you begin to see interesting patterns, and if you cross a kind of threshold in the amount of material you're working with, like you go from maybe 50 points to 100 or 1,000, then GIS can help you manage the extra data load and interrogate it in more ways. But your first steps are absolutely the thing to do. So take your time. Don't jump to GIS unless you're technically minded. And you're like, I know students who can teach themselves GIS in 3 months. I've been at it for 15 years and I still really struggle with it. It's not natural to me. So I keep working with paper. Some folks who attended my morning workshop heard me say that I always start students making maps with paper. And then if they're ready or they really have to go to a digital platform, they do it then. But do your initial conceptualization and working with your evidence on paper. Absolutely. It takes more money. It takes more time. We have to be sensible about these things. Yeah. And then find a student from the geography department who already knows GIS who can help you think about whether it can help you. Honestly. Students love to be creative collaborators with faculty. It's so cool. It makes them important, as they are. Yes?
To follow up on that question, one of the important things I'm taking away from your talk today, your workshop this morning, is that you do make that leap to GIS. That sometimes you see your research represented back to you very different way
Yes.
than you might be trained to represent it to yourself.
Yes.
Is that, I mean, how often do you find that that's the case?
That's what we call, professionally speaking, you're Brian, right? No, I've forgotten your name. Yes, yes. Eric, sorry. Eric may have heard this phrase as a geography student. The eureka moment. When any of us, but particularly people who have not worked geographically before, when you see your data displayed geographically, I've heard it so many times, people say, oh my God, I had no idea. So that very first map I showed you of the distribution of concentration camps was a eureka moment for Paul Jascott, for my collaborator, who had no idea how thin and attenuated the Baltic camps were because they loomed large in his imagination. They came late, they were small, they didn't last long, etc. So simply displaying location can be really helpful. I hope that, well, in my experience, that's rarely the end of the story. But it is a tremendous engine for new questions and for realizing what you don't know. Yeah. There was a hand. Yes, Rebecca.
So following again on this point is once you've gotten to the point where you decide it's worthwhile to visualize this information,
Mm-hmm.
you're making it available for other researchers to investigate. Have you seen researchers investigating the information from the Holocaust?
Oh, we have not made this information available to other researchers.
Certainly got a lot of press.
It has.
New York Times.
Yeah, but we haven't posted it. Oh, I see. So you're asking how have people responded to the work or how have they used the data?
Research or build new questions and go somewhere with
I haven't actually. No, that's not true. No, I'm trying to think how best to answer this. I haven't heard of any research projects by individuals or groups on the geography of the Holocaust inspired by our project. I have learned about others who are doing this kind of work elsewhere. I went to a conference actually at the International Tracing Service offices in Bad Arolsen in Germany last May and learned that a woman almost entirely on her own effort had created an atlas of the atrocities and concentration camps in Lithuania and had produced this atlas of the Lithuanian Holocaust that is the most powerful argument against denial in Lithuania that you can imagine. I met another German scholar who had worked with a team of people with virtually no funding, just out of a sense of obligation to document the Holocaust in Italy, where there's also a very strong history of denial. The official position by the Italian academics that Alberto Giordano on our research team has talked with personally is that it was a German action in Italy. The Italians were scarcely involved, and a famous scholar acknowledged 8 or 9 concentration camps in Italy. This German scholar I met at Bad Arolsen has documented 536 camps in Italy. And that's an online atlas that he hopes to release soon. So this work is not just us. When our book comes out in June, of course, we hope that it will have some impact, but we don't know yet. And we're prepared for some people to be distressed. We've had objections, particularly from people in Jewish studies, literary scholars, religious scholars, who find the maps abstract and dehumanizing. How can you make any person, but especially a Jew in the Holocaust, a purple dot on a map? That's just offensive to some. And we continue to grapple with how to answer that question. We take it seriously. But we'll see. We'll see. We think it will at least be read. Yes?
So could you speak a little bit more to the content of the book and how you're
Sure.
seeking to sort of contextualize those maps and make that link between the maps and the human story a little bit more?
Oh, thanks. That's a great question. The book is in 6 chapters, each one of our case studies, and they work through the scales from the camps through the regional studies and down to the evacuation study. There is an afterword at the end that tries to suggest a future agenda for research, as we are wont to do in academic collections. And then we also have an introductory essay that explains what we're trying to do. Each of the chapters is richly illustrated. For us, the graphics are analytical, And the way we tried to write the book, we set out certain writing parameters for ourselves at the beginning. So every chapter is co-authored by at least 2 people, which was a real challenge, believe me. Bringing a feminist and a GI scientist into conversation, that was real interesting. How do you write? How do you... So we tried to strike a balance in our language that's not too technical, but explains technical concepts that are crucial. And the dialogue is the text is always in dialogue with the visuals, so that the text and the captions explain what you're to glean from the images. We never just point. So that has become for me a sort of credo in this kind of work. Intensely visual work ought to be substantive. And so that's what we've striven for in this book. Yes?
So then, does each chapter have a central research question that emerged as part of your analysis and then your provisional answer?
Yes. And this was actually a surprise for us. When we started this project with the funding from NSF in 2008, the goal was just to see if geography might be an interesting way to approach the Holocaust and which methods might be useful. But in every case study, we found unanswered research questions, some of them suggested by the visualization of evidence, that we were at least partly able to begin to answer. For example, in the concentration camps chapter, by visualizing the opening and the activity of labor camps, that is, what kinds of labor was being done in each of the camps, we found that there was a misunderstanding in the historiography. One of the major explanations of the uses of labor in Holocaust history is that Jews in particular, but others as well, were put to labor in German munitions factories, making arms for the German army, everything from bullets to great big cannon and aircraft and so forth. And this is particularly gruesome and ironic, of people making weapons for their own destruction, right? But what we found by looking really closely at what was actually going on at camps during what period of time, because of the encyclopedia that gave us that information and attaching it to particular points, at least half of the camps that were intended to be arms manufacturing sites never reached the point of production. So labor, in fact, was being put to construction, and that has implications for the labor because construction is the most grueling, has the highest fatality. There are men digging tunnels and hauling stone and lumber and out in all weather. So that helps explain the spike in mortality at camps late in the war. People are also being starved, so there are many things going on. But this seems an important qualification of the historiography that came out of the research. And then the Budapest chapter, I think, is the most revisionistic of the historiography. It even changed Tim Cole's interpretation of his own work from the past. So we're encouraged by those results and hope to continue in the second phase with leading with research questions. We're now convinced the methodology is useful, the geographic approach is useful. Now we're asking research questions. And our big question now, our new phase of research is going to be quite different. Instead of building great big databases, we're now going to start working in league with the Shoah Foundation at USC, which has videotaped tens of thousands of survivors' testimony, most of them only video testimony. They haven't been transcribed. So we have to develop methodologies for extracting the geographic information and qualities of experience from those testimonies and try to understand them geographically. We think we'll be working at that individual level for several years before we can finally aggregate up to bigger stories like what happened to Dutch women in the Holocaust. And it's not that we're not reinventing things here, but we're bringing some new answers and asking some new questions. Yes?
So the NSF didn't ask, how can geography help you to understand the Holocaust? They had a different sort of call for proposals. Do you recall what the call was, and then this was your response to it?
The general call was just research in geoscience.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it wasn't one of the specific programs. We had a number of really helpful conversations with the geoscience program officers at NSF when we wanted to apply. And they told us, it wasn't officially in the call, but they told us that they were interested in interdisciplinary work, especially reaching into the humanities. So we framed that first proposal as using GIS and GI science methods in particular to try to understand an important historical event. And they bought it, and they're pleased that the results have been substantial. Yeah. Yes?
I wanted to jump on that last part. How are people in the humanities looking at geography these days? How do they see geography and what we do?
I think many people in the humanities, especially people younger than 50, or maybe younger than 40, think that geography is really hot. Geography is really interesting. It has fascinating concepts that have colloquial everyday richness and analytical bite. We have analytical tools like GIS and cartography and statistical analysis in some case too, that are really useful for dealing with large amounts of data. And so they're flocking to us. Unfortunately, from my point of view, geographers are not reciprocating very well. Humanities research in geography remains a tiny part of the discipline, terribly undervalued. It makes me really angry. I think it displays a kind of ideology and intolerance that should not be tolerated in academia. There's my platform. But certainly it's really fun to work with humanists who are eager and curious and try to help them cultivate their own understanding of geography and frame their own questions. Yes?
You talked a little this morning about the siloing that takes place in the humanities.
Mm.
And I'm wondering if you can kind of address, looking at your projects at the Holocaust Museum and the work that you've done with students, it seems like you've been able to build these dream teams. So can you kind of share your personal do's and don'ts when it comes to building these interdisciplinary projects?
The question is, how do you build a dream team? And the questioner is referring to, I had a whole list this morning. It ended up being like 10 or 12, actually, 10 or 12 ideas for how to do successful collaboration with students or with fellow scholars. Maybe the highlights for me, the most important things, would be the idea that Paul Jascott gave us in the Holocaust research group originally, to set aside your egos and don't worry about being an authority. Admit that there are many things you don't know and that others in the team might be able to do instead of you or teach you how to do. Academics are trained to be authorities, and they pin their hopes and their status on being the best at something or being as good as somebody else. We're constantly watching out for the pecking order and feeling concerned that what we're going to say may be criticized by someone. If you can turn that around and say, there's an awful lot I don't know, but look at this really cool thing that I think I'm figuring out, it changes the whole tone of the discussion. And with students, it opens you up to them as a regular person so that they're not as intimidated by you, and there's more room for them to claim a little bit of authority and mastery and superiority over you. I love it when my students give me that smirk like, ha, you really don't understand, do you? Yeah, that's right, I don't, but you do, and how great is that, right? So that's one thing. And then something I didn't mention this morning, this is maybe item 14, I don't know. I think professors should be talent scouts. I think a lot of us do this instinctively, that you're aware of who the good students are, and you're aware of who the really keen ones are. And if you can find a special skill or aptitude is really key. And then energy or interest. You want that person with you, even if they can't yet do what you might want them to do, but they'll be ready to learn. And students learn so much faster than we do, so that even in the course of one semester or a year or two, if you have them that long, they can really achieve something great. And then have fun. Let yourself have fun, let the students have fun, let your scholars have fun. Mock one another, make it okay to be silly. blow off steam, because this kind of work is really intense and people need to be able to know that it's okay to let down their guard and just relax. Have them over to your house for dinner. Yes, ma'am.
I loved your talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm asking now if you could comment on the role of libraries and museums for their repository role and their preservation and organizational skills. Were they of assistance? You haven't mentioned them as underlying.
Yes. Thank you. That is an unfortunate omission. I should work on that. The Holocaust Museum opened the way for this project. They are, of course, very interested, as any major archive is, any archive, in having their collections used. They have this summer workshop program through the Center of Advanced Holocaust Studies, where they pay to bring scholars to work together for 2 weeks, as they brought us. So that was, without that, this project never would have started. They provided the data for the concentration camp study. It would have taken us years to pull that together if they had not given us that wonderful kickstart for the project. And they've agreed to continue to provide the data that they develop for the rest of the encyclopedia. I am myself an archival scholar. In all of my previous work before the Holocaust, I buried myself in the archive and I wrote my book. For this project, I'm faced with the dilemma of how to find the time to return to being an archival scholar and relearning German, let alone learning Polish or Russian or French or Ukrainian or whatever else to be an archival scholar, and I don't think I have the years left to do that. So I think I may have to give up that part of scholarship, which is crucial, but build alliances with students and other scholars who can use the archival collections, because we need that in the long run for the quality of the analysis. So I know that there are many libraries that are becoming very active in supporting digital scholarship in many, many ways. At Middlebury, the particular strengths of the geography department have meant that I haven't needed library support much, but I do always, because we teach in-house what our students use then in this kind of work. But I have gone to special collections every year, sometimes every semester, to get students exposed to primary documents, because that excites them about history better than any lecture I can give. When they find a letter or a diary or a map that interests them, it becomes the seed for a really exciting project. So I love that kind of relationship with libraries, and I hope all of my students come out loving their librarians as much as they love their professors. Yes?
Let me ask the opposite direction from the library. When you have developed these very extensive data sets, and you say you've developed them basically all the time from Gettysburg and Iron and such, are they getting archived at Gettysburg, the Smithsonian, or do they remain with you? And how much access do other scholars have to those? You know, that's a huge amount of the time you spend is developing them.
Yes. None of my data has yet been archived. I have been approached by 2 different archives in Pennsylvania to hold, university archives, to hold the Ironworks database. The most serious interest was from Penn State University, where Derek Holdsworth, geographers will know his name, has been trying to develop with the library there a digital collection of historical materials for research on Pennsylvania and the Mid-Atlantic. But they haven't been able to raise the funding that would be necessary for me to hire someone to do the final work to clean up the data. I'm extremely reluctant to share data and have it publicly used if it's not as good as I can possibly make it. So my perfectionism stands in the way of releasing that data set. The Gettysburg data set, similarly, it's a terrain surface that I've let other people use. A man from NASA has used it. Another scholar with an avocational interest in the Civil War has been trying to improve the quality of the historical terrain by using current LIDAR data and so forth. And I'm happy to share it sort of on a one individual level, but I haven't found an archive for that. Smithsonian really isn't in that kind of business. And I mean, Smithsonian Institution maybe should be, but not Smithsonian Magazine, and yeah. And then for the Holocaust data, the Holocaust Museum wants to host our data, but their website is not equipped with a map web server or a database server. That's a whole different level of support, and they have no one on staff who does GIS. So we hope to host our data eventually at Texas State, where Alberto Giordano has institutional interest in doing this, but they're not set up yet either. And the bigger question is, where do you put your time? I mentioned this to the workshop this morning, that I have kind of decided consciously, but it's also just the way things have gone, that I feel my best value is creating the work, writing it up, and then going on to the next thing. Not taking another year to put the data up on the web in case somebody might want to use it. And there's a common assumption in the digital humanities today, and digital work more generally, that all data should be up online because people might want to use it. Well, how many people are really going to use a database of the iron industry from 1800 to 1858? 2, 3, maybe a teacher somewhere. A few people have, but they haven't really needed it. They were actually looking for information about 1 or 2 ironworks, and I could give it to them. So is it worth a year of my time to set up something a few people might use? In the case of the Holocaust, I think that's a much bigger thing, but we need money to do that too. To do it properly, we ought to hire someone, so it has to go into the next grant. So, long-winded answer to no. Yes, ma'am.
Follow-up. Did your funding from NSF require a data management plan that required you to make that data available?
They wanted public distribution of the results. So our book certainly does that. We also, the group collectively has put out about 8 articles out of the research. So our NSF officers have told us we've more than satisfied that requirement. But at the time we wrote the grant, we also said that we would host the data on the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's website. And we do have a very small presence there. But for the technical reasons I mentioned, they're not able to host the data and have a big presence for us. They would like to, but there are technical and staffing issues there, and so we haven't gotten there yet. Yes?
Sorry, can I just ask the question, are many institutions really set up to host this kind of digital?
Well, Middlebury College sure isn't.
It seems like if you can't get the hosting part of it done, you're working on little steps, but
yeah.
So
This is a big issue I think we're all facing, getting involved in digital scholarship.
That's why she's part of the infrastructure phase of this series.
How do you do it? Is it worth doing? How much does it cost? How long will it last? Who's going to use it, etc. In historical research, what I think most of us are doing is building databases to answer our questions. Well, that's not true actually. There are lots of people who are trying to build the big machine that can answer lots of questions. This is what national historical GIS databases do, that they are a lot of demographic data with administrative boundaries that scholars can use in many, many ways, which is excellent. But when you build a database to answer your particular questions, its utility to others, I think, is much lower than trying to build a big machine. And I've also seen a lot of projects end up on the rocks because they say, oh, we should add this, and we should add that, and we should have more layers, and then we should go over and cover this territory, and they end up chasing data, and it becomes a sort of loose grab bag of stuff that you run out of money, and you run out of steam, and nothing happens. So my own preference is to do something purposeful that contributes to our understanding of history through publications. So that's my trajectory. Yes?
I would like to comment on your comment that one of the questions, unanswered questions, is, quote, how long will it last?
Mm-hmm.
Because that is the role of libraries in perpetuity to make that information available. So reconsider mounting that information at a library repository forever.
Well, if somebody will provide money to Penn State, I would love, they are the place that should have my industrial data set.
Penn State has plenty of money.
Oh, well.
And on that note,
I guess I haven't tapped it. That's my problem.
please join me in thanking Ann Knowles for this great talk. Thank you.